Hey guys, this is Mark. In this video, I'm going to show you something super cool, which is a complete mobile application built without any coding whatsoever. 100% client-side, server-side, full integration with the database, and a multi-screen app which is running here in the iOS emulator. For the client side of the app, I used a platform called dropsource.com, and for the server side, of course, we're using Backendless. So I'm going to demonstrate how this app works. It is, as you can see, a to-do application, and to-do apps, as basic as they are, is a great example of using the entire suite of database operations, as we can create new items, get a list of items, modify an object in the database, delete one. Here there is also integration with a user login, so different users who log in will see their own to-do lists. So now let me log in to my account in that application, and you will see how it works momentarily. After this video, I'm going to walk you through the entire process of building this app without any coding using DropSource and Backendless. So now let's just log in, and here it is. I have a list of my to-do items. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the backend as well, so you can see there is this to-do items table in Backendless console, and as I add a new to-do item, so let's just say it's going to be conduct a demo of the to-do app. If I click save, you see that in Backendless it is automatically reflected because of real-time database. So any changes that I make in the application are automatically reflected in Backendless console. So for example, let's say I completed the conference call with the client, which is right here. Right now the completed column shows false. If I select this toggle, it automatically becomes true on the server side. So whenever I change the status of this toggle, an API call is made to the server to update the state of that item. So let's say if I also conducted a demo of this app, so here it is, now we have both items as true. If I swipe it, I can delete this item and it's also deleted on the server side. Or if I log out, I go back to that screen. So very, very simple application, but the beauty of this is that I had to write 0 lines of code. The whole app fully functional that you can deploy on your phone and then proceed to deploying it with to the App Store, and you can build way more complex things because Backendless provides a complete suite of the database operations, complete set of functionality related to user management, user registration. You can do file uploads. Pretty much everything that you need from the backend is provided by Backendless through the APIs, and with DropSource you can do pretty much everything that is needed on the client side, both for Android and for iOS. So the demo is right here, as you can see, very basic, but the cool thing is how you actually go about building things with DropSource and Backendless. So now I'm going to switch to a brand new project in DropSource, and we will start building this to-do application from scratch. So follow along and you will arrive at exactly the same app. And the most important thing here is that you will gain the knowledge of how to work with these two systems, DropSource and Backendless. Let's start building our app. For this, you will need to create an account with dropsource.com and with backendless.com. Both platforms provide a free tier, which will be sufficient to build the to-do app. I already have an account. I'm going to sign in to DropSource. Here, this is the app that I used for the demo that you saw earlier, but I'm going to create a new one. Select iOS. You're welcome to experiment with Android. The process is going to be very similar, but if you want to follow along and build exactly the same app that I have demonstrated, I recommend selecting iOS. Click Next in the starter templates. Select or go with the default, which is the blank template, and give it a project name. I'm going to name it To-Do App. Then you will see it in the list, and click the Open Editor button. So this is the interface of drop source. On the left-hand side, it gives you the sections where you can add pages, set up elements. Elements are individual components that you can drag and drop to your pages. Variables gives you access to setting up device variables. You have settings and lifecycle, and throughout this tutorial, we will be going through and using pretty much all of these sections. So to start, we're going to create a page, and we will call it the landing page. And here you will give it a name, landing. The very first page you create is automatically a landing page. You can change it later by using this key icon, and once you have more pages, you can select which one is the landing page. But if you create the first one as landing, then it will be automatically marked as landing. I will quickly style it, and we'll just play it through on a higher speed, so we don't lose a lot of time on styling and so on. The purpose of the landing page, as you will see very shortly, will be to determine if the user has previously logged in and we have user session information, or if the user is not logged in, then we will need to present with the login page. This configuration will come a little bit later, but for now let's create the second page, which will be the login page. So go to the Pages section, click plus. Here click Next, and give it a name. We're going to call it Login. So now we have the login page. I will also style it and add the components. The video will play at a higher speed, but you should be able to follow along. Now that the components are added and the page has been styled, the only thing we need to do, as far as the logic is concerned at this point, is to configure an event for these text fields. And the event is supposed to hide the keyboard whenever user types in the value and presses the return button. We want the keyboard to go away. And to do this, select the email text field, and you will see the properties for the text field, and then switch to the Events tab. Here, these are the events that are triggered whenever a user works with this component. The one we're interested in is the returned event. Click the Add button, and then let's add an action. Search for this action by typing in the hide word, and you will see the hide keyboard event. Select it, and then close, and repeat exactly the same thing for the password field. Returned event, add, and then hide keyboard. So now both of these fields have the events configured. We will not be doing anything at this point with the login page, and for now let's add the list page. The list page is going to be different than the other two since it's going to have a navigation bar. Therefore, select the checkbox here, give it a name, call it list. And now we are going to style this page, add the button here to log out, and then there's going to be another button to add a new item, and then also the title and just the general styling. At this point, before we go any further, it makes sense to switch to Backendless to set up the backend, get the API exported, and then we will return back to drop source to continue development of the client side. On the Backendless side, I already have an account logged in. Whenever you log in for the first time to Backendless console, you'll be presented with a similar screen where you can create your backend application. Here in the name field, I will enter the name, which will be to-do app. The referral code is optional. Click create, and the backend app with the database and everything else is going to be created for you. Switch to the data screen, which is basically the front end for your database, and click on the plus icon here to create a new table. The table will be named to-do items. And then the console will prompt you to create a schema, which basically define the columns that will be contained in that table. Click yes, and there will be two columns. One of them is going to be called title. The data type is going to be string. And then the second column, click new, it's going to be called completed, which will be a Boolean column, and it will indicate whether the item is completed or not. The default value, select false for that. Click create, and then if you return to data browser, you can actually enter some sample to-do items, just so whenever you run your application, you will actually see something which will be useful for testing purposes. So here, let's say the to-do item is going to be pick up groceries. Go to a workout, say learn Spanish. Okay, so now we have three items, and notice that I was clicking the new link here to create a new item. Now the database is ready, we have some data in it, and now we need to get the API for that specific table. To get the API, click the REST console tab. Here you can actually use this REST console to play with the API. In fact, you click get and you will see what the sample output is. But from the integration perspective, we need to get the actual API docs for this specific table. You will notice there is a generate API docs link. Click on it. And then the first item is exactly what we will need, which is the Swagger 2.0 JSON format. Click generate and click copy. So here there is a URL which contains the API for this specific table, and this is the API that will be imported into drop source. Now since it was copied, you can close, and before you return to drop source, we need to enable access to this URL that was copied into the clipboard. To do this, click the users icon and then select security roles and select not authenticated user. By default, file access through the URLs is disabled. Click this X, so it is now green check mark. And you can actually validate that the URL that you copied for the API docs is accessible by opening a new tab in the browser, paste the URL, and you can see that it comes back. Now we're going to return to drop source and import this API. In here, pretty much for any of the screens, you can start with a login screen, switch to this API tab. The actual page is irrelevant. The API tab is available everywhere. Click on the plus icon, and in here where it says enter API spec URL, just paste the URL that was copied from Backendless. Click add, and then all the APIs for that data table are automatically imported, and they are available now for all pages. As you can see, I'm switching between the pages and the API is there. The very first thing that we need to do from the API perspective is going to be on the login screen, because here we will actually be integrating with the authentication API. Here in the list of all the APIs, you need to select this specific route, which is post/users/login, and then click add. Then this API is added from the list. Click on it, and you will see there are two parameters. So here there is one that is called login, the other is password. That is what's going to be sent to the server. So now to associate these fields with these parameters in the API, simply drag login and drop it onto the email, and drag password and drop it onto the password field. There is going to be this green dot that shows up right here, and this is an indication that the fields in the API are mapped to the specific fields in the UI. And in order to send this API, whenever the login button is clicked, what you need to do is click the login button, and then make sure to go to the button properties right here. This is the first tab, and select events. There's going to be an event called tapped. Click on the add button, and then here, whenever that button is clicked, we need to send an API. In the search actions, type in API, and you will see run API request. Select that and then edit, and then here we have the API request to do the login. Click done and save. So now whenever the login button is clicked, a request is going to go out to the server to perform the actual login. It's very important to also handle errors, because whenever an error occurs, we need to display that error message to the user. And in order to do that, if you go back to the APIs, in here we still have the login API selected. Click the responses, and this is the format of the response whenever the response is 200. This is what comes back, and then for all the error responses, you can select one of them. You will see there will be code and the message. So for all the error responses, whenever there is an error, we need to display it to the user. In order to provide this information to the user, let's add a field to the login screen. So click Elements and select Label, and drag that label to the screen. I'm going to make it a little bit larger because that error message may not fit on a single line. And let's style this error. So change the color to perhaps red. And we can change the number of lines, let's say to 4 lines. And the line break will be by word wrapping. And we could make the font size a little bit smaller, let's say 14 points. All right, so now the actual text that is in there can be removed. The field is here. And now we need to map the responses from the APIs, the error responses, to this field. So for 1 by 1, let's say for 400, and we are here on the API for the login. In the responses, I selected 400, which is an error. Drag this message and drag it to this field. So now the message is mapped to this field. You will need to repeat all of these error codes and drag message for all of them to that field. This way, regardless of what the error is, the user will see exactly what has happened wrong, and which will basically provide a much better user experience. So this is how the error handling will work. Also, whenever it is 200, this is what comes back. We will need to create the logic where if the user is successfully logged in, then part of the response is a field called user token, which is extremely important. And let's talk about it now. So user token is returned by Backendless whenever user is logged in, and the value of this user token property represents a user session. That value needs to be sent back to the server for all the subsequent requests, and because that's how user is going to be identified, how that user session is identified. So what we need to do is whenever user is successfully logged in, this user token needs to be stored somewhere on the device, in memory, in the transient memory, so this value is available all the time, but also it needs to be stored in a more permanent storage, which is called keychain storage, for the reason that if the application is shut down and started later on, we still know that user token and we do not require user to log in again. In order to save the value of the user token in the device's memory, we need to declare a device variable first. For this, click the Variables section and click plus to declare a new variable. Let's call it user token, and the type of it is going to be select from data types, select Swift, and then select string, which basically says that this is just a string value. Click Save. So now we have this variable. Now that this variable is defined, we can actually save the value of the user token received from the server in it. To do this, we still have the login API selected, and we are on the Responses tab. Click the Events tab, and we see that for every single HTTP response code, 200 represents successful response. We can add an event, which basically would mean that whenever we get successful login, this is what we need to execute. Click Add, and there will be a series of actions here. So number one, we need to set the value. So search for set, and then select Set Value, and edit. And then here, we're going to set, in the device variable, user token, we're going to set the value, which is event data, 200, body, and select user token. So this basically says, take this user token from the response from the server and put it into the user token variable on the device. Click Save. This is number one. Number two, we're going to save this value in the keychain. And to save the value in the keychain would basically mean if the app is closed, then we still have this user token for the subsequent runs. Here, search for keychain, and we will need to save value to the keychain. Click Edit, and in here, select static input, string, and user token. What this basically means is in the keychain, the values are stored as key value pairs, where key is really the name of this property. The name of the property is going to be user token. And then the value will be, now we're going to pull from the device variables, the user token variable. Okay, so click Save. So notice that in the set value, we got it from the response, put it into the device variable. Next, we're going to take it from the device variable and put it into the keychain. And then finally, after these two things are done, we're just going to redirect control to the page, to the next page, because now we're logged in and we want the user to see a list of their to-do items. So then the final step will be go to page, and then we will transition to the list page. And here just select the push-up transition type. This is it as far as handling successful response for the login. Now that we have declared the user token device variable and we have stored value in the keychain, we could actually go to our pages and select the landing page. And for the landing page, we can set up an event when this page is when this page appears. So let's just kind of mentally think about we're launching this application, landing page appears, we need to check, has this user logged in before, which basically would mean that we have user token in the keychain. If the value is there, then great, we're going to show the list of the to-do items. If the value is not in keychain, then we need to show the login screen. So this would be handled on the landing page, and then we are in the events. For the page appeared, click add, and then in here, type in keychain, and we will select retrieve a value from keychain. The value that we're going to be retrieving will be user token, because we just saved it. Save that user token into this keychain key value pair. Click save. So if the keychain value found, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to redirect the user to a page. Go to page, and that's going to be transitioned to list because the value is there. We know who that user is. Set up the transition. And if the keychain value is not found, what are we going to do? Well, once again, we're going to go to page, but in this case, it is going to be the login page. Very easy. So now we have this flow control that is happening on the landing page. Something else that is very important, and you'll probably notice that we have this warning right here with an error. If you click on it, it says Backendless to-do items API, it requires authentication. And this comes in here for the reason that we started using the APIs. We now have programmed the login API, but DropSource is smart enough because it looked at the API spec generated by Backendless, and that API spec says Backendless requires that user token is present whenever you communicate to Backendless. So there is this visual alert that we need to fix something. And in order to fix this, let's go back to the API section. And here on the Backendless to-do items API, click these three dots, and then there is going to be a set authentication item. Click on set authentication, and it says user token header. So there is going to be user token that needs to be present in every single request. Click edit, and then the API key is going to be coming from device variables user token. Select that, click save, and notice that the error now is gone. Okay, there are no errors. At this point, we have pretty solid logic to try because first of all, we know that the app will start. It will check the keychain storage. If the value is not going to be there because we have never executed this app yet, and we should see the login screen. And then on the login screen, we will be running the login API. But at this point, if we go back to our Backendless application, click Data, and click the Users table, there are no users here. So we will not be able to log in until we actually register. So there is a Register button, and for the simplicity's sake, we're not going to be creating a registration form. So let's just reuse these two fields to register the user. And in order to do this, since we are already on the API tab, select this particular route, post/users/register, and click add. Then expand this API, and this is going to be the body, the actual parameters that are sent to the server as a part of the registration. Just like you did it for the login, click email and drag it onto the email field, and the same thing for password. And for the register button, click register, go back to the button properties and select events, just like it is already selected here. And then whenever this button is tapped, we want to send the registration API call. So click add, and then let's add the API, search for API, and then select run API request. And then here in the requests, make sure to select the one for the registration. Click register, and then click save. And now with this configuration in place, when the user taps the register button, the user information will go to the server, and it will show up in the user's table, and user will subsequently be able to log in. The registration API also may produce some errors, like for example, if user tries to register with an email that already exists in the database. Those errors would need to be handled exactly the same way that we're handling errors for the login call. Since we already have this field where the error messages will be displayed, we need to handle it exactly the same way, and for the HTTP responses that are not 200, basically from 400 and above, the message needs to be dragged over to this field. This way, whenever an error occurs, the user would be informed. So just like I'm doing right now, where I select an error HTTP code and dragging the message to this error area, you would need to do exactly the same, just so the application provides the information about any errors. Okay, so this completes the part where the registration is handled, the login is handled, and now we can safely move on to the listing of the to-do items, and then add the core logic of displaying to-do items, adding a new one, editing, and deleting. Now that you are on the list page, let's switch to the elements section, and the list page will contain a dynamic table component. So what you need to do is to find under dynamic views, table view, and drag it right into the main area of your list page. So this is going to be your table view. For the table view, select it, and in the properties sheet, make sure to find the content property and change it to dynamic, because the contents of this area are going to be dynamic based on what you receive from the server. The table view needs to contain a table cell, and you will find this table view cell, drag it right into the table view, and this component we will configure sort of as a template as to what a single to-do item should look like. And specifically, it will contain a label right here. This label will display the title of the to-do item. You can make it wider just so you can fit more text into it. And there is also going to be a toggle that is responsible for visualizing whether this to-do item is done or not done. You can always switch to the element tree, and right here you should have this hierarchy in whenever you're done. So at the very top we have this list, which is the page, then it contains the table view. Table view contains table view cell, a single item, that contains a label and a switch. I'm using the default names, but you're welcome to change the names of these components. This will become particularly handy if you move on to downloading the code from drop source, just so you can run the builds in your application. Once you have set this up, the next step is to configure the API for retrieving the to-do items. For this, switch to the API tab, and in the list you will find Get To-Do Items, this particular API, select it, and then click Add, and then navigate to that API. Switch to the responses. You will see that the response contains an array. A single item in this array is going to be the data source containing title and the completed fields. So what you will need to do is drag this data source right into the table view, release it. So now the data source is mapped to this area. The title needs to be mapped to the label, and the completed property needs to be mapped to the toggle. That's all. So this establishes the mapping, and once you start getting the responses, drop source generates the code that will automatically fill up this particular view with all your to-do items. Now that you have configured this API, it is important to make this API call. And this API call should be made whenever the list page shows up on the screen of your device. In here, make sure that the list is selected, so that in the element tree, switch to list and go back. So now we have the list selection. and then switch to events, and page appeared is the event that you need to configure. So click on the add button for page appeared, and in here we're going to run an API call, edit, and then select the get to do items API. Click save. So now we have created all the wiring where when the page appears it makes the API call, that API call returns this response, and then all the data will be rendered on the screen. Once the data is rendered, the only thing that the user can do with any given item here is to change its state, whether it's completed or not, and the state would be changed by using the toggle. However, there is also an API that sends a request to Backendless to update the state of a particular item. Let's add this API. In here you will find the following item, which will be put data to do items, and then there is object ID. It's going to be the very last in the list. Select it and then click add, and then navigate to it. Switch to the parameters section and then make sure to select path. Notice that in the path, in this curly braces, there is a parameter, object ID. This will need to be provided in the configuration that we will set this up right now, where for any given to-do item, it includes object ID, which is something Backendless assigns to that object. So whenever we modify the state of this to-do item, we need to get this object ID and put it right there in the path. To do this, select path as I have right now, and here we have object ID. So click on this object ID and then select data source, table view, stored to do items. This is a scrollable panel, and then in the stored to do items select object ID and then select done. So this is how you would configure a dynamic parameter in the path, so it is mapped exactly to the item where you click the toggle. Now that object ID is going to show up in the path, there is also a parameter in the body. So notice that in the body we're sending the completed property, which represents the actual state of that to-do item in the UI. So the completed property needs to be mapped to this toggle, and whenever we tap this toggle, this will basically be either true or false depending on what the toggle state is. Now that the API is configured, it is important to actually wire this toggle to the API, so whenever the toggle state changes, an API request goes out. So click on the toggle, and then in the properties you will see the styles, and then switch to the events. And then in the events for the switch, there is a value changed event. Click the add button, and then let's add an action, which will be the API call. And that's going to be this one right here, the one with the object ID in the path. Done, and click save. So now there is the entire logic is already in the application. When toggle value changes, an API request goes out. That API request will have the proper object ID in the path and the proper value in the body representing the state, and that will update the state of that to-do item in the database on the Backendless side. There are two functional areas that are left to create the logic for. One is the logout, and the other one is adding a new to-do item. So for the logout, we need to add the logout API. Now we are on the API section. Let's add this API. It's going to be post/users/logout. Click add. So this API is configured, doesn't take any parameters, it just needs to be wired into the application. And for the switch to the element tree, select list, then go back to the list, events, and we have the left navigation bar item. So whenever the left bar item tapped, this is going to be the event. And in here, we need to do a couple of things. First of all, we're going to run the API to perform the actual logout. This one. So next we need to reset the user token device variable, type in value and select set value. Device variables, select user token, and then the actual value is going to be an empty string. Click Save. And then we need to delete the value from the keychain. Because remember, whenever we logged in the user, we set the user token in the device variable, and we also saved that user token in the keychain storage. So now on the logout, we need to remove it from both variable, which is what we just done, and also remove it from the keychain storage. So here we just need to identify the name of the property in the storage. That's going to be user token. Finally, whenever all these things are done, we just need to redirect the user to the login screen. Login. And that's it. So that's the implementation for the logout. Before we create the add new, I recommend actually testing this just to see how it works, because we have already quite a bit of functionality. In fact, we have pretty much all of the functionality except for adding a new to-do item. So let's go ahead and click the test button. This will create the build of the application, and we will be able to run it in the iPhone simulator right in the browser. Creating the build may take some time, but be patient. Whenever it is done, you will see this tooltip showing up, and you will see the click to open link. Click on it, and to run the application, just click the Test in Web Simulator button. In fact, let's go ahead and run the test build to see what the application looks like in the simulator. The simulator comes up right away. You can actually select the simulator type. You can toggle the option to see the network traffic, which is very useful if you need to debug any API requests that the application sends out to Backendless. You can easily get a link to the simulator by clicking this icon right here and just open it in the browser, and the application runs completely separately. So there are plenty of options here. Most of them are very self-explanatory. But now tap to play. The application is loaded in the simulator, and we can actually experience it firsthand. So now this is the very first time we run the application. We will need to register first. I'm going to use my email address and click register, and that sends out an API request to Backendless. In fact, if we go back to the console and here in the users table, now there is information about the user, and if we were to click the login button, then the application just logs in and retrieves a list of the to-do items. In fact, we see that there are these 3 to-do items that we created earlier, and now they are loaded into the application. If we change the status on one of them, let's say pick up groceries, the toggle is on, and we go back to the database and we see for pick up groceries the completed is now true, which means that an API request went out and the database has been updated. Logout sends a logout request and brings it back to the login screen. So everything is working exactly as we designed. There are only 2 things left to be implemented. One of them is going to be adding a new item, and the second is deleting an item entirely. So let's focus on that now. On the Pages section, click the plus icon and select the page with a navigation bar. Click Next, and let's call it Add New. This is going to be the page. We will set the title to say Add New To Do. We will also enable left navigation, which will say back. to return back to the list of the to-do items. For consistency, let's set the background to be dark. And similarly for the navigation bar. The title color, we'll make it lighter. Change this to medium. So now it's fairly consistent. There are two components we want to add. One of them is a text view. For this text view, make sure to select editable and selectable. We can also get rid of the simple text. And also there's going to be a button to save this text in the database. Title is going to be save. Let's also style it similarly to what we did with the other buttons. Now that the UI is ready, let's add API to add an item in the database. This is the route you want to select: post data to do items. Click add. Click to expand the API. In the body we have the completed and the title. The title will be matching this text area. And now we need to wire this API to the click of the save button. So we selected the button, switch to the events view, and on the tapped event we will add the API call. Now that we have executed the API request to create an item, we need to return to the previous page. And for this, let's add another action. And here we can select go back a page. As for the back button right here in the navigation bar, whenever the left bar item tapped, and we have only left item, we need to execute some logic. Click add, and then here search for page, and we want to select go back a page. Make sure to edit this configuration, and in the page presented modally, select false. The only thing that is left to be done is to wire the button on the list page, this one, add new. We need to display the add new page whenever this navigation button is clicked. So for this, let's select list and right bar item tapped, click add, search for page, and then go to page. We will transition to the add new page. So this is all it takes to configure and add the logic for adding a new to-do item. Now that is done, let's focus on deleting a to-do item from the list. The very first thing that we will need to do is to add the API. We'll make sure that the list page is selected, and then we're going to add the API. There is going to be an API that looks like this: delete data to do item / object ID. Click add and navigate to that API. In here, in the path, very similarly to what we did when we were updating an item, here we need to configure the object ID. Click on it, and then in the data source, select table view, stored to do items, and then in here select object ID. That establishes the path for object ID. And we need to configure the actual event in the UI, so select this item and then go to the table view cell, select events. Notice there is cell swipe to delete, click add, And in here, there's going to be a sequence of events that we need to do, because first of all, we need to call the API to delete this item on the server. That's very easy. Just select it, done, click Save. But also we need to make sure that the item that we're swiping is actually removed from the list of the to-do items. And to do that, the next action that we need to configure is going to be called getting an index for a table cell index. Search for index. Notice there is get table cell index. Select elements and then the table view cell, which we will be working with. Notice it returns index path. And finally, the last action we need to add is going to remove that cell. So search for remove cell, removing a cell from dynamic table. Click edit. This is the table view. Select. The index, the cell index is going to come from action data, and get table cell index, index path. Click done, and then the row and animation, just pick whatever you like. Fade is good enough for me. Click save, and that's it. So now the swiping to delete has been configured, and we can actually do another build to see how the complete application works. The build is now done. Let's click to open and run it in the simulator. Click tap to play to download and install the app into the simulator. And let's try it out to see how it works with all the functionality in there. Log in. We get a list of all the to-do items. Let's add a new one. Let's call it read a book. Click save. Item is added. Read a book is here. Let's take a look on the server side. Here's our read a book. And let's say pick up groceries has been done. Swipe. Now there is delete. Click and it's gone. And let's take a look on the server. And this is gone here as well. So here we have a complete application exactly as the one that I was demonstrating earlier at the very beginning of this video. But now you have it in your project. If you followed along, you should have exactly the same application running in your drop source project. This is quite exciting because here we spent, well, it is about an hour, but this hour hopefully was worth it because you should get an idea of how drop source works, how Backendless works, how to integrate these two systems together to build very powerful applications without writing any code at all. We have a few more videos like this and tutorials planned out where we will be building a chat application and some other interesting apps that will give you an idea of other things that you can do with both drop source and Backendless. And until then, definitely play around and let us know what you think. We would love to see some examples of what you are building. There's a lot more to this. You can deploy it to your devices. You could do a bunch of other stuff on the back end, including custom business logic, but let's leave those topics of discussion for future videos. And until then, happy codeless coding.